Leviticus, the 11th chapter and the first verse. Foods. God spoke to Moses and Aaron, speak to the people of Israel, tell them of all the animals on earth, these are the animals that you may eat. You may eat any animal that has a split hoof divided in two and that chews the cud, but not an animal that only chews the cud or only has a split hoof. For instance, the camel chews the cud but doesn't have a split hoof, so it's unclean. The rock badger, I wouldn't eat that anyways, chews the cud but doesn't have a split hoof, and so it's unclean. The rabbit chews the cud but doesn't have a split hoof, so is unclean. The pig has a split hoof divided in two but doesn't chew the cud, and so is unclean. You may not eat their meat nor touch their carcasses. They're unclean to you. Among the creatures that live in the water of the seas and streams, you may eat of any that have fins and scales. But anything that doesn't have fins and scales, whether in seas or streams, whether small creatures in the shallows or huge creatures in the deeps, you are to detest. Yes, detest them. Don't eat their meat, detest their carcasses. Anything living in the water that doesn't have fins and scales is detestable to you. These are the birds you are to detest. Don't eat them. They are detestable. Eagle, vulture, osprey, kite, all falcons, all ravens, ostrich, nighthawk, seagull, all hawks, owl, cormorant, ibis, water hen, pelican, Egyptian vulture, stork, all herons, hoopoe, bat. I wouldn't eat those anyways. All flying insects that walk on all fours are detestable to you, but you can eat some of these, namely those that have jointed legs for hopping on the ground. All locusts, katydids, crickets, and grasshoppers, katydids. But all the other flying insects that have 4 legs you are to detest. No problem there. You will make yourselves ritually unclean until evening if you touch their carcasses. If you pick up one of their carcasses, you must wash your clothes and you'll be unclean until evening. Every animal that has a split hoof that's not completely divided or that doesn't chew the cud is unclean for you. If you touch the carcass of any of them, you become unclean. Every 4-footed animal that goes on its paws is unclean to you. If you touch its carcass, you are unclean until evening. If you pick up its carcass, you must wash your clothes and are unclean until evening. They are unclean for you. Among the creatures that crawl on the ground, the following are unclean for you: weasel, rat, all lizards, gecko, monitor lizard, wall lizard, skink, chameleon. Among the crawling creatures, these are unclean for you. If you touch them when they are dead, you are ritually unclean until evening. When one of them dies and falls on something, that becomes unclean no matter what it's used for, whether it's made of wood, cloth, hide, or sackcloth. Put it in the water. It's unclean until evening, and then it's clean. If one of these dead creatures falls into a clay pot, everything in the pot is unclean, and you must break the pot. Any food that could be eaten but has water on it from such a pot is unclean, and any liquid that could be drunk from it is unclean. Anything that one of these carcasses falls on is unclean. An oven or cooking pot must be broken. They're unclean and must be treated as unclean. A spring, though, or a cistern for collecting water remains clean, but if you touch one of these carcasses, you're ritually unclean. If a carcass falls on any seeds that are to be planted, they remain clean. But if the water has been put on the seed and a carcass falls on it, you must treat it as unclean. If an animal that you are permitted to eat dies, anyone who touches the carcass is ritually unclean until evening. If you eat some of the carcass, you must wash your clothes and you are unclean until evening. If you pick up the carcass, you must wash your clothes and are unclean until evening. Creatures that crawl on the ground are detestable and not to be eaten. Don't eat creatures that crawl on the ground, whether on their belly or on all fours or on many feet. They are detestable. Don't make yourselves unclean and be defiled by them, because I am your God. Make yourselves holy, for I am holy. Don't make yourselves ritually unclean by any creature that crawls on the ground. I am God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Be holy, because I am holy. These are the instructions on animals, birds, fish, and creatures that crawl on the ground. You have to distinguish between the ritually unclean and the clean, between living creatures that can be eaten and those that cannot be eaten. Leviticus chapter 12, childbirth. God spoke to Moses, tell the people of Israel, a woman who conceives and gives birth to a boy is ritually unclean for 7 days, the same as her menstruation. On the 8th day, circumcise the boy. The mother must stay home another 33 days for purification from her bleeding. She may not touch anything holy or enter the sanctuary until the days of her purification are complete. If she gives birth to a girl, she is unclean for 14 days, the same as during her menstruation. She must stay home for 66 days for purification from her bleeding. When the days for purification for either a boy or girl are complete, she will bring a yearling lamb for a whole burnt offering and a pigeon or dove for an absolution offering to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting. He will offer it to God and make atonement for her. She is then clean from her flow of blood. These are the instructions for a woman who gives birth to either a boy or a girl. If she cannot afford a lamb, she can bring 2 doves or 2 pigeons, one for the whole burnt offering and one for the absolution offering. The priest will make atonement for her, and she will be clean. Leviticus chapter 13, infections. God spoke to Moses and Aaron. When someone has a swelling or a blister or a shiny spot on the skin that might signal a serious skin disease on the body, bring him to Aaron, the priest, or to one of the priest's sons. The priest will examine the sore on the skin. If the hair and the sore has turned white and the sore appears more than skin deep, it is a serious skin disease and infectious. After the priest has examined it, he will pronounce the person unclean. If the shiny spot on the skin is white but appears to be only on the surface and the hair is not turned white, the priest will quarantine the person for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest will examine it again. If in his judgment the sore is the same as not spread, the priest will keep him in quarantine for another 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest will examine him a second time. If the sore is faded and hasn't spread, the priest will declare him clean. It is a harmless rash. The person can go home and wash his clothes. He is clean. But if the sore spreads after he has shown himself to the priest and has been declared clean, he must come back again to the priest, who will conduct another examination. If the sore is spread, the priest will pronounce him unclean. It is a serious skin disease and infectious. Whenever someone has a serious and infectious skin disease, you must bring him to the priest. The priest will examine him. If there is a white swelling in the skin, the hair is turning white, and there is an open sore in the swelling, it is a chronic skin disease. The priest will pronounce him unclean. But he doesn't need to quarantine him because he's already given his diagnosis of unclean. If a serious disease breaks out that covers all the skin from head to foot, wherever the priest looks, the priest will make a thorough examination. If the disease covers his entire body, he will pronounce the person with the sore clean. Since it has turned all white, he is clean. But if they are open, running sores, he is unclean. The priest will examine the open sores and pronounce him unclean. The open sores are unclean. They're evidence of a serious skin disease. But if the open sores dry up and turn white, he is to come back to the priest, who will re-examine him. If the sores have turned white, the priest will pronounce the person with the sores clean. He is clean. When a person has a boil and it heals, and in place of the boil there's a white swelling or a reddish whitey shiny spot, the person must present himself to the priest for an examination. If it looks like it has penetrated the skin and the hair in it has turned white, the priest will pronounce him unclean. It is a serious skin disease and has broken out in the boil. But if the examination shows that there is no white hair in it and is only skin deep and is faded, the priest will put him in quarantine for 7 days. If it then spreads over the skin, the priest will diagnose him as unclean. It is infectious. But if the shiny spot has not changed and hasn't spread, it's only a scar from the boil. The priest will pronounce him clean. When a person has a burn on his skin and raw flesh turns into a reddish white or white shiny spot, the priest has to examine it. If the hair is turned white in the shiny spot and it looks like it is more than skin deep, a serious skin disease has erupted in the area of the burn. The priest will pronounce him unclean. It is a serious skin disease and infectious. But if on examination there is no white hair in the shiny spot and it doesn't look to be more than skin deep but is faded, the priest will put him in quarantine for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest will re-examine him. If by then it has spread over the skin, the priest will diagnose him as unclean. It is a serious skin disease and infectious. If by that time the shiny spot has stayed the same and has not spread but is faded, it is only a swelling from the burn. The priest will pronounce him clean. It's only a scar from the burn. If a man or woman develops a sore on the head or chin, the priest will offer a diagnosis. If it looks as if it is under the skin and the hair in it is yellow and thin, he will pronounce the person ritually unclean. It is an itch, an infectious skin disease. But if when he examines the itch, he finds it only skin deep and there's no black hair in it, he will put the person in quarantine for 7 days. On the 7th day, he will re-examine the sore. If the itch has not spread, there is no yellow hair in it, and it looks as if the itch is only skin deep, the person must shave except for the itch. The priest will send him back to quarantine for another 7 days. If the itch has not spread and looks to be only skin deep, the priest will pronounce him clean. The person can go home and wash his clothes. He's clean. But if the itch spreads after being pronounced clean, the priest must re-examine it. If the itch is spread in the skin, he doesn't have to look any further for yellow hair. For instance, he is unclean. But if he sees that the itch is unchanged and the black hair has begun to grow in it, the itch is healed. The person is clean and the priest will pronounce him clean. When a man or woman gets shiny or white shiny spots on the skin, the priest is to make an examination. If the shiny spots are dull white, it's only a rash that has broken out. The person is clean. When a man loses his hair and goes bald, he is clean. If he loses his hair from his forehead, he is bald and he is clean. But if he has a reddish white sore on scalp or forehead, it means a serious skin disease is breaking out. The priest is to examine it. If the swollen sore on his scalp or forehead is reddish, white, like the appearance of the sore of a serious skin disease, he has a serious skin disease and is unclean. The priest has to pronounce him unclean because of the sore on his head. Any person with a serious skin disease must wear torn clothes, leave his hair loose and unbrushed, cover his upper lip, and cry out, "Unclean, unclean." As long as anyone has the sores, that one continues to be ritually unclean. That person must live alone. He or she must live outside the camp. Leviticus chapter 14. God spoke to Moses. These are the instructions for the infected person at the time of his cleansing. First, bring him to the priest. The priest will take him outside the camp and make an examination. If the infected person has been healed of the serious skin disease, the priest will order 2 live clean birds, some cedar wood, scarlet thread, and hyssop to be brought for the one to be cleansed. The priest will order him to kill one of the birds over fresh water in a clay pot. The priest will then take the live bird with the cedar wood, the scarlet thread, and the hyssop and dip them in the blood of the dead bird over fresh water, and then sprinkle the person being cleansed from the serious skin disease 7 times and pronounce him clean. Finally, he will release the live bird in the open field. The cleansed person, after washing his clothes, shaving off all his hair, and bathing with water, is clean. Afterwards, he may again enter the camp. But he has to live outside his tent for 7 days. On the 7th day, he must shave off all his hair, from his head, beard, eyebrows, all of it. He must then wash his clothes and bathe all over with water. He will be clean. The next day, the 8th day, he will bring 2 lambs without defect and a yearling ewe without defect, along with roughly 6 quarts of fine flour mixed with oil. The priest who pronounces him clean will place him in the materials for his offerings in the presence of God at the entrance to the tent of meeting. The priest will take one of the lambs and present it, and the pint of oil as a compensation offering, and lift them up as a wave offering before God. He will slaughter the lamb in the place where the absolution offering and the whole burnt offering is slaughtered in the holy place, because like the absolution offering, the compensation offering belongs to the priest. It is most holy. The priest will now take some of the blood of the compensation offering and put it on the right earlobe of the man being cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. Following that, he will take some oil and pour it into the palm of his left hand, and then with the finger of his right hand, sprinkle oil 7 times before God. The priest will put some of the remaining oil on the right earlobe of the one being cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot, placing it on top of the blood of the compensation offering. He will put the rest of the oil on the head of the man being cleansed and make atonement for him before God. Finally, the priest will sacrifice the absolution offering and make atonement for the one to be cleansed from his uncleanness. Slaughter the whole burnt offering and offer it with the grain offering on the altar. He has made atonement for him. He is clean. If he is poor and cannot afford these offerings, he will bring 1 male lamb as a compensation offering to be offered as a wave offering to make atonement for him, and with it a couple of quarts of fine flour mixed with oil for a grain offering, a pint of oil, and 2 doves of pigeons which he can afford, one for an absolution offering and the other for a whole burnt offering. On the 8th day, he will bring them to the priest at the entrance to the tent of meeting before the presence of God. The priest will take the lamb for the compensation offering together with the pint of oil and weigh them before God as a wave offering. He will slaughter the lamb for the compensation offering, take some of its blood and put it on the lobe of the right ear of the one to be cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, on the big toe of his right foot. The priest will pour some of the oil into the palm of his left hand, and with his right finger sprinkle some of the oil from his palm 7 times before God. He will put some of the oil that is in his palm on the same places he put the blood of the compensation offering, on the lobe of the right ear of the one to be cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. The priest will take what is left of the oil in his palm and put it on the head of the one to be cleansed, making atonement for him before God. At last he will sacrifice the doves or pigeons, which are within his means, one as an absolution offering and the other as a whole burnt offering, along with the grain offering. Following the procedure, the priest will make atonement for the one to be cleansed before God. These are the instructions to be followed for anyone who has a serious skin disease and cannot afford the regular offerings for his cleansing. God spoke to Moses and Aaron. When you enter the land of Canaan, which I'm giving you as a possession, and I put a serious fungus in the house in the land of your possession, the householder is to go and tell the priest, I have some kind of fungus in my house. The priest is to order the house vacated until he can come and examine the fungus so that nothing in the house is declared unclean. When the priest comes and examines the house, if the fungus on the walls of the house has greenish or rusty swelling that appears to go deeper than the surface of the wall, the priest is to walk out the door and shut the house up for 7 days. On the 7th day, he is to come back and conduct another examination. If the fungus has spread in the walls of the house, he is to order that the stones affected by the fungus be torn out and thrown in a garbage dump outside the city. He is to make sure the entire inside of the house is scraped and the plaster that is removed be taken away to the garbage dump outside the city. Then he is to replace the stones and replaster the house. Them priests had a job to do. Wow. If the fungus breaks out again in the house after the stones have been torn out and the house has been scraped and plastered, the priest is to come and conduct an examination. If the fungus is spread, it is a malignant fungus. The house is unclean. The house is to be demolished. Its stones, wood, and plaster are to be removed to the garbage dump outside the city. Anyone who enters the house while it is closed up is unclean until evening. Anyone who sleeps or eats in the house must wash his clothes. But if when the priest comes and conducts his examinations, he finds that the fungus has not spread after the house has been replastered, the priest is to declare that the house is clean. The fungus is cured. He then is to purify the house by taking 2 birds, some cedar wood, scarlet thread, and hyssop. He will slaughter 1 bird over fresh water in a clay pot. Then he will take the cedar wood, the hyssop, the scarlet thread, and the living bird, dip them in the blood of the killed bird and fresh water, poor birds, and sprinkle the house 7 times, cleansing the house with the blood of the bird, the fresh water, the living bird, the cedar wood, the hyssop, and the scarlet thread. Now, what did the bird do? Last of all, he will let the living bird loose outside the city in the open field. He has made atonement for the house. The house is clean. These are the procedures to be followed by every kind of serious skin disease or itch, for mildew or fungus on clothing or in a house, for a swelling or blister or shiny spot, in order to determine when it is unclean and when it is clean. These are the procedures regarding infectious skin diseases and mildew and fungus. Leviticus chapter 15, bodily discharges. God spoke to Moses and Aaron, speak to the people of Israel. Tell them, when a man has a discharge from his genitals, the discharge is unclean. Whether it comes from a seepage or an obstruction, he is unclean. He is unclean all the days his body has a seepage or an obstruction. Every bed on which he lies is ritually unclean. Everything on which he sits is unclean. If someone touches his bed or sits on anything he sat on, or touches the man with the discharge, he has to wash his clothes and bathe in water, and he remains unclean until evening. If the man with the discharge spits on someone who is clean, that person has to wash his clothes and bathe in water. He remains unclean until evening. Every saddle on which the man with the discharge rides is unclean. Whoever touches anything that has been under him becomes unclean until evening. Anyone who carries such an object must wash his clothes and bathe with water. He remains unclean until evening. If the one with the discharge touches someone without first rinsing his hands with water, the one touched must wash his clothes and bathe with water. He remains unclean until evening. If a pottery container is touched by someone with a discharge, you must break it. A wooden article is to be rinsed in water. When a person with a discharge is cleansed from it, he is to count off 7 days for his cleansing, wash his clothes, and bathe in running water. Then he is clean. On the 8th day, he is to take 2 doves or 2 pigeons and come before God at the entrance of the tent of meeting and give them to the priest. The priest then offers one as an absolution offering and one as a whole burnt offering, and makes atonement for him in the presence of God because of his discharge. When a man has an emission of semen, he must bathe his entire body in water. He remains unclean until evening. Every piece of clothing and everything made of leather which gets semen on it must be washed with water. It remains unclean until evening. When a man sleeps with a woman and has an emission of semen, both are to wash in water. They remain unclean until evening. When a woman has a discharge of blood, the impurity of her menstrual period lasts 7 days. Anyone who touches her is unclean until evening. Everything on which she lies or sits during her period is unclean. Anyone who touches her bed or anything on which she sits must wash his clothes and bathe in water. He remains unclean until evening. If a man sleeps with her and her menstrual blood gets on him, he is unclean for 7 days, and every bed on which he lies becomes unclean. If a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, but not at the same time of her monthly period, or has a discharge that continues beyond the time of her period, she is unclean, the same as during the time of her period. Every bed on which he lies during the time of the discharge and everything on which he sits become unclean, the same as in her monthly period. Anyone who touches these things becomes unclean and must wash his clothes and bathe in water. He remains unclean until evening. When she is cleansed from her discharge, she is to count off 7 days. Then she is clean. On the 8th day, she is to take 2 doves or 2 pigeons and bring them to the priest at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Tell you, they're killing some doves and pigeons here. The priest will offer one for an absolution offering and the other for a whole burnt offering. The priest will make atonement for her in the presence of God because of the discharge that made her unclean. You are responsible for keeping the people of Israel separate from that which makes them ritually unclean, lest they die in their unclean condition by defiling my dwelling, which is among them. These are the procedures to follow for a man with a discharge or an emission of semen that makes him unclean, and for a woman in her menstrual period, any man or woman with a discharge, and also for a man who sleeps with a woman who is unclean. Leviticus chapter 16, the Day of Atonement. After the death of Aaron's two sons, they died when they came before God with strange fire. God spoke to Moses, tell your brother Aaron not to enter into the Holy of Holies, barging inside the curtain that's before the atonement cover on the chest whenever he feels like it, lest he die, because I am present in the cloud over the atonement cover. This is the procedure for Aaron when he enters the holy place. He will bring a young bull for an absolution offering and a ram for a whole burnt offering. He will put on the holy linen tunic and linen underwear, tie the linen sash around him, and put on the linen turban. These are the sacred vestments, so he must bathe himself with water before he puts them on. Then from the Israelite community, he will bring 2 male goats for an absolution offering and a whole burnt offering. Aaron will offer the bull for his own absolution offering in order to make atonement for himself and his household. Then he will set the 2 goats before God at the entrance to the tent of meeting and cast lots over the 2 goats, one lot for God, the other lot for Azazel. He will offer the goat on which the lot of God to God falls as an absolution offering. The goat on which the lot for Azazel falls will be sent into the wilderness to Azazel to make atonement. Aaron will present his bull for an absolution offering to make atonement for himself and his household. He will slaughter his bull for absolution offering. He will take a censer full of burning coals from the altar before God and 2 handfuls of finely ground aromatic incense and bring them inside the curtain and put the incense on the fire before God. The smoke of the incense will cover the atonement cover, which is over the testimony, so that he doesn't die. He will take some of the bull's blood and sprinkle it with his finger on the front of the atonement cover, then sprinkle the blood before the atonement cover 7 times. Next, he will slaughter the goat designated as the absolution offering for the people and bring the blood inside the curtain. He will repeat what he does with the bull's blood, sprinkling it on and before the atonement cover. In this way, he will make atonement for the Holy of Holies because of the uncleanness of the Israelites, their acts of rebellion, and all their other sins. He will do the same for the tent of meeting, which dwells among the people in the midst of their uncleanness. There is to be no one in the tent of meeting from the time Aaron goes in to make atonement in the Holy of Holies until he comes out, having made atonement for himself, his household, and the whole community of Israel. Then he will come to the altar that is before God and make atonement for it. He will take some of the bull's blood and some of the goat's blood and smear it all around the 4 horns of the altar. With his finger, he will sprinkle some of the blood on it 7 times to purify and consecrate it from the uncleanness of the Israelites. When Aaron finishes making atonement for the Holy of Holies, the tent of meeting, and the altar, he will bring up the live goat, lay both hands on the live goat's head, and confess all the iniquities of the people of Israel, all their acts of rebellion, all their sins. He will put all the sins on the goat's head and send it off into the wilderness, let out by a man standing by and ready. The goat will carry all their iniquities to an empty wasteland. The man will let him loose out there in the wilderness. Finally, Aaron will come into the tent of meeting and take off the linen clothes in which he dressed to enter the Holy of Holies and leave them there. He will bathe in water in a holy place, put on his priestly vestments, offer the whole burnt offering for himself and the whole burnt offering for the people, making atonement for himself and the people, and burn the fat of the absolution offering on the altar. The man who takes the goat out to Azazel in the wilderness then will wash his clothes and bathe himself with water. After that, he will be permitted to come back into the camp. The bull for the absolution offering and the goat for the absolution offering, whose blood has been taken into the Holy of Holies to make atonement, are to be taken outside the camp and burned, their hides, their meat, and their entrails. The man assigned to burn them up will then wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. Then he is free to come back into the camp. This is a standard practice for you, a perpetual ordinance. On the 10th day of the 7th month, both the citizen and foreigner living with you are to enter into a solemn fast and refrain from all work, because on this day atonement will be made for you to cleanse you. In the presence of God, you will be clean of all your sins. It is a Sabbath of Sabbaths. You must fast. It is a perpetual ordinance. The priest who is anointed and ordained to succeed his father is to make the atonement. He puts on the sacred linen garments. He purges the Holy of Holies by making atonement. He purges the tent of meeting and the altar by making atonement. He makes atonement for the priests and all the congregation. This is a perpetual ordinance for you. Once a year, atonement is to be made for all the sins of the people of Israel. And Aaron did it, just as God commanded Moses. Leviticus chapter 17, holy living, sacrifices, and blood. God spoke to Moses, speak to Aaron and his sons and all the Israelites. Tell them, this is what God commands. Any and every man who slaughters an ox or lamb or goat outside, inside or outside the camp, instead of bringing it to the entrance of the tent of meeting to offer it to God in front of the dwelling of God, that man is considered guilty of bloodshed. He has shed blood and must be cut off from his people. This is so the Israelites will bring to God the sacrifices they're in the habit of sacrificing out in the open fields. They must bring them to God, and the priest at the entrance to the tent of meeting, and sacrifice them as peace offerings to God. The priest will splash the blood on the altar of God at the entrance of the tent of meeting and burn the fat as a pleasing fragrance to God. They must no longer offer their sacrifices to goat demons. Wow, a kind of religious orgy. This is a perpetual decree down through the generations. Goat demons. Tell them, any Israelite or foreigner living among them who offers a whole burnt offering or peace offering but doesn't bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting to sacrifice it to God, that person must be cut off from his people. If any Israelite or foreigner living among them eats blood, I will disown that person and cut him off from his people, for the life of an animal is in the blood. I provided the blood for you to make atonement for your lives on the altar. It is the blood, the life that makes atonement. That is why I tell the people of Israel, don't eat blood. The same goes for the foreigner who lives among you. Don't eat blood. Any and every Israelite, this also goes for the foreigners, who hunts down an animal or bird that is edible, must bleed it and cover the blood with dirt, because the life of every animal is its blood. The blood is its life. That's why I tell the Israelites, don't eat the blood of any animal, because the life of every animal is its blood. Anyone who eats the blood must be cut off. Anyone, whether native or foreigner, who eats from an animal that is found dead or mauled must wash his clothes and bathe in water. He remains unclean until evening and is then clean. If he doesn't wash or bathe his body, he'll be held responsible for his actions. This is the word of the Lord.